The thunder over Memphis that night sounded like artillery. It was April 3rd, 1968, and the storm outside the Mason Temple was relentless, shaking the heavy glass windows, drowning out the murmurs of the 2,000 people packed inside. They had braved the tornado warnings to see him, but the man who finally stepped up to the microphone looked exhausted. His eyes were heavy, burdened by a fever and a weariness that went deeper than his bones. He didn't just speak about civil rights or justice that night. He spoke about his own end. In a moment that still chills the soul decades later, he looked out at the faces before him and delivered a prophecy that history would never forget. I may not get there with you. He was talking about the promised land, but the silence in the room suggested he was also talking about a funeral. Less than 24 hours later, on April 4th, 1968, a single rifle shot rang out at the Lorraine Motel, silencing the voice that had shaken the foundations of America. But did Martin Luther King Jr. know the Memphis assassination was coming? Did he see the shadow of death standing in the back of the room during his final sermon? I've been to the Mountaintop. Long before the world knew him as the man who had a dream, he was simply a boy named Michael. Born at noon on January 15th, 1929, in an upstairs bedroom at 501 Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, he entered a world that was already divided by an invisible, ironclad curtain. The house on Auburn Avenue was a sanctuary, a place filled with the smell of Sunday dinners and the sound of his mother, Alberta, playing the piano. But just outside those walls, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. In the 1930s, Atlanta was the heart of the segregated South. It was a place where the color of your skin dictated where you could sit, where you could eat, and even where you could be buried. For young Michael, the first heartbreak didn't come from a tragedy, but from a simple, confusing reality of childhood. He had a best friend, a white boy whose father owned a store across the street. They were inseparable, bound by the innocent logic of play. But the day they turned 6 and started school, the curtain fell. The white boy went to a school for whites. Michael went to a school for blacks. That wasn't the end of it. One afternoon, Michael ran across the street to play, just as he always had. But the mother of his friend met him at the door with a cold, flat refusal. She told him to go home. When he asked why, she didn't hesitate. She told him that they were getting older now, and because he was colored, he could no longer play with her son. It was a small moment, quiet and domestic, but it shattered his world. He ran home in tears, confused and hurt, demanding answers from his parents. That was the day he first learned the history of his people, the slavery, the struggle, and the systemic humiliation. But if the world outside tried to break his spirit, the man inside his home was forging it into steel. His father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., was a force of nature, a man who refused to bend. There is a story often told about a trip to a downtown shoe store. Young Michael and his father sat in the empty seats near the front. The clerk, a white man, approached them nervously and said, "I'll be happy to wait on you if you'll just move to those seats in the rear." Daddy King didn't blink. "There's nothing wrong with these seats," he replied, his voice low and steady. "We're quite comfortable here." The clerk insisted, citing the laws of the land. Daddy King stood up, took his son's hand, and walked out. On the sidewalk, he looked down at Michael and said words that would echo for decades. "I don't care how long I've been living with this system, I will never accept it." This was the fire that shaped Martin Luther King Jr. long before he stood behind a pulpit. He saw dignity in resistance. He saw that silence was a form of consent. As he grew, the boy named Michael began to change. In 1934, his father traveled to Berlin for a Baptist convention and was inspired by the story of the great German reformer Martin Luther. Upon his return, he changed his own name and the name of his 5-year-old son. Michael King became Martin Luther King Jr. It was a heavy name to carry, a name associated with challenging the church, challenging the state, and changing the course of history. By the time he entered Morehouse College at the tender age of 15, the internal conflict was intense. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a preacher. He saw the ministry as old-fashioned, emotional, and disconnected from the intellectual rigors of the modern world. He wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer, someone who could heal bodies or change laws. But But he soon realized that the church was the only place in Black America where a leader could speak freely without fear of losing his job to a white boss. It was the only platform that belonged entirely to the people. He surrendered to the call, but he would not be a preacher of the past. He would be a preacher of the social gospel. He devoured the works of Thoreau on civil disobedience and Gandhi on nonviolent resistance. He began to understand that love was not just a sentimental emotion to be shared between individuals. It was a potent tool for social transformation. His first major test came not in Atlanta, but in Montgomery, Alabama. He was young, only 26, with a new wife, Coretta, and a baby daughter. He had accepted the pastorate at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, hoping for a quiet start to his career. But history does not wait for convenience. On a cold December evening in 1955, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. The community needed a voice. They needed someone young enough to have energy, educated enough to articulate their pain, and brave enough to stand in the crosshairs. They turned to Martin Luther King Jr. He didn't ask for the role. In fact, he was terrified. On the night he was elected to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association, he went home and prayed. He wasn't praying for victory. He was praying for strength. He knew that by stepping into that light, he was putting a target on his back and on the backs of his family. Yet, when he stood before the overflowing crowd at Holt Street Baptist Church that first night of the boycott, something happened. The fear melted away, replaced by a clarity of purpose. He told them, "We are tired. Tired of being segregated and humiliated. Tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression." The response was thunderous. It was the sound of a people waking up. For 381 days, they walked. They walked through rain and heat, through threats and bombings. Martin Luther King Jr. walked with them, his home bombed, his life threatened, his family harassed. But he never struck back. He preached that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. This was the beginning. The boy from Auburn Avenue had found his voice. The civil rights movement had found its leader. But as the victories mounted, so did the darkness. The path from Montgomery would lead to high mountains, but it would also lead through valleys of death that no one, not even he, could fully anticipate. By the early 1960s, the name Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just a name. It was a lightning rod. The movement had grown beyond the bus stops of Montgomery. It had spilled into the lunch counters of Greensboro, the freedom rides across the deep South, and the bloody streets of Birmingham. 1963 was the year the dam broke. In Birmingham, Alabama, the world watched in horror as Police Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on peaceful protesters, many of them children. The images of students being slammed against brick walls by jets of water were broadcast into living rooms across America and the globe. It was a turning point. The brutality of segregation was no longer a hidden Southern secret. It was a national shame. From a jail cell in that very city, scribbling on the margins of a newspaper because he had no paper, King wrote what would become the manifesto of the civil rights movement, the letter from Birmingham jail. In it, he dismantled the critics who told him to wait. He wrote with the patience of a saint but the fire of a prophet. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. But the true crescendo came in August. Washington, D.C., August 28, 1963. The heat was stifling. It rose from the pavement in shimmering waves, but it couldn't stop the tide. They came by train, by bus, by car, and on foot. 250,000 people, black and white, rich and poor. They flowed like a mighty stream toward the Lincoln Memorial. It was the largest demonstration for human rights in United States history. Backstage, Martin Luther King Jr. was nervous. He had been up until 4 a.m. the night before, wrestling with his speech. His aides had debated every word, every phrase. The prepared text was political, structured, and safe. It was designed to appeal to Congress and the Kennedy administration. When he stepped up to the podium, the shadow of Abraham Lincoln stretched behind him. The crowd fell silent, a sea of expectant faces stretching all the way to the Washington Monument. He began reading from his prepared notes. The voice was steady, the rhetoric soaring, but something was missing. It was a speech, but it wasn't yet a sermon. Then, a voice cried out from behind him. It was the legendary gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. She shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." King paused. In that split second, he made a choice that would define his legacy. He pushed the prepared text aside. He stopped being a political leader and became the preacher from Atlanta. He looked up, not at his notes, but at the people. "I have a dream," he began. The rhythm changed. The cadence became musical. It was a riff, an improvisation of the soul. He spoke of a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. He spoke of his 4 little children living in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. "I have a dream today," he roared, and the crowd roared back. For those 17 minutes, time stood still. Even the most hardened cynics wept. It wasn't just a speech, it was a spiritual experience. That day, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just articulate the pain of the past. He painted a picture of the future so vivid that people felt they could touch it. The following year, 1964, the world answered. At the age of 35, he became the youngest man ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He traveled to Oslo, Norway, to accept the award on behalf of the civil rights movement. In his acceptance speech, he spoke of the long and desolate night of racial injustice, giving way to a bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. He was on top of the world. He was the moral leader of the nation, a global icon, and a Nobel laureate. But the view from the mountaintop is often deceptive. While the cameras flashed and the accolades poured in, the ground beneath him was shifting dangerously. Victory came with a terrible price. Just weeks after the triumph in Washington, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 little girls attending Sunday school. It was a brutal reminder that a dream could not stop dynamite. The Nobel Prize brought prestige, but also brought envy and suspicion. In the shadows of Washington, J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful director of the FBI, was seething. He called King the most notorious liar in the country. The FBI intensified its surveillance, tapping King's phones, bugging his hotel rooms, and compiling dossiers on his private life. They weren't just watching him. They were trying to destroy him. They sent him anonymous letters urging him to commit suicide. They leaked stories to the press to tarnish his reputation. Furthermore, the movement itself was fracturing. Younger activists, impatient with the slow pace of nonviolence, began to chant Black Power. They saw King's methods as too passive, too accommodating to white America. To them, he was becoming an Uncle Tom, a relic of the past. At the same time, King's own conscience was expanding. He realized that civil rights were not enough if people were still starving. He began to speak out against poverty, planning a poor people's campaign to occupy Washington. And then, he did the unthinkable. He came out against the Vietnam War. On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, he delivered a speech at Riverside Church in New York called Beyond Vietnam. He called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The backlash was instant and vicious. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had signed the Civil Rights Act, felt betrayed and cut off all contact. Major newspapers like the New York Times criticized him. Donors stopped writing checks. By 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was exhausted. He was physically drained, suffering from migraines and insomnia. He was politically isolated, attacked by both the white establishment and a new generation of black militants. The man who had stood so tall on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial was now carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt the walls closing in. He talked more frequently about death. He seemed to know that the clock was ticking. And yet, he kept moving. He kept preaching. He kept marching. It was this weary, heavy-hearted king who received the call to go to Memphis. The sanitation workers there, men who spent their days hauling garbage for starvation wages, were on strike. They carried signs that simply read, "I am a man." They needed a voice. Despite the threats, despite the exhaustion, despite the warnings from his staff that Memphis was a trap, he couldn't say no. He packed his bag. He kissed his wife goodbye. He headed toward the storm, toward the final confrontation between the dream and the nightmare. The descent began on a plane. It was the morning of April 3rd, 1968, and Martin Luther King Jr. was boarding Eastern Airlines Flight 381 to Memphis. But before the engines could roar to life, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. He apologized for the delay, explaining that there had been a specific threat. Someone had claimed there was a bomb on board targeting Dr. King. All luggage had to be checked. All passengers had to be rescreened. King sat in his seat, staring out the window. He was no stranger to death threats. They arrived in his mailbox almost daily, but this felt different. The air was thick with a specific kind of malice. When he finally arrived in Memphis, the city was tense. The sanitation strike had turned ugly days earlier, with windows smashed and tear gas filling the streets. The mayor had declared martial law. Tanks rolled down the avenues where King had hoped to lead a peaceful march. He checked into the Lorraine Motel, a modest two-story establishment that was one of the few decent hotels in Memphis that welcomed black guests. He was given room 306 on the second floor, a room he had stayed in so many times that the staff simply called it the King Abernathy Suite. But there was no rest to be found. That night, a storm battered the city. Rain lashed against the concrete, and tornado sirens wailed in the distance. King was exhausted. His throat was sore, and a fever was creeping in. He told his best friend, Ralph Abernathy, that he couldn't speak at the rally scheduled at the Mason Temple. He asked Abernathy to go in his place. But when Abernathy arrived at the hall, he found 2,000 people waiting. They hadn't come for a surrogate. They had come for the man himself. Abernathy called the motel room. "Martin," he said, "you have to come. These people are here for you." King put on his coat and went out into the rain. Inside the Mason Temple, the atmosphere was electric but heavy. The roof rattled with the thunder outside. When King took the pulpit, he didn't look like a politician. He looked like a man unburdening his soul. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of a blues song. He recounted the history of the movement, the victories, and the struggles. But as he neared the end, his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the back wall of the church, something only he could see. He began to talk about the threats. He talked about the plane delay. He talked about a demented woman who had stabbed him years earlier. And then he delivered the words that would haunt the world forever. "We got some difficult days ahead," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the Mountaintop." The crowd shouted back, urging him on, not knowing they were witnessing a farewell. "And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." He finished abruptly, almost collapsing into the arms of his aides. His eyes were filled with tears. It was the speech now known as "I've been to the Mountaintop." It wasn't a rally cry. It was a eulogy for himself. Back at the Lorraine Motel later that night, his brother A.D. King noticed Martin seemed different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. He had said his goodbye. The next day, April 4th, 1968, dawned gray and cool. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, eerie stillness. King spent most of the day in room 306, working on sermons and joking with his staff. He was in high spirits. They had a pillow fight, a rare moment of childish joy in a life consumed by serious purpose. He called his mother in Atlanta to check on her. He teased his friend Andrew Young. By late afternoon, they were getting ready for dinner at the home of a local minister. King washed his face and put on his jacket. At 6 p.m., he stepped out onto the balcony of room 306 to get some fresh air. Below, in the parking lot, stood the musician Ben Branch, who was scheduled to play at the event that night. King leaned over the railing. He looked calm, almost serene. He called down to Branch. "Ben," he said, "make sure you play 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord' in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Those were the last words Martin Luther King Jr. would ever speak. At 6:01 p.m., a sharp crack echoed through the air. It sounded like a car backfiring or perhaps a firecracker. But it was neither. From a boarding house window across the street, a single .30-06 caliber bullet had been fired. It tore through the neck of the man on the balcony, severing his spinal cord. The impact knocked him backward, his tie torn away, his eyes wide open but unseeing. Inside the room, Abernathy heard the noise and ran out. He found his friend lying in a pool of blood on the concrete floor of the balcony. He knelt down, cradling King's head in his hands, patting his cheek, whispering, "Martin, Martin, can you hear me?" But there was no answer. The eyes that had seen the mountaintop were now fixed on a gray Memphis sky. Sirens began to wail, closer and louder this time than the storm the night before. Police cars screeched into the parking lot of the Lorraine Motel. Officers pointed towards the boarding house across the street, where a bundle containing a rifle would soon be found. But it was too late. An ambulance arrived, its red lights flashing against the twilight. They loaded him onto a stretcher. The man who had marched millions of miles for freedom was now being rushed through the streets of Memphis alone. At St. Joseph's Hospital, doctors worked frantically. They opened his chest, trying to massage his heart back to life. But the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had done its job with brutal efficiency. At 7:05 p.m. on April 4th, 1968, the announcement was made. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead at the age of 39. The news hit the world like a physical blow. In a Lorraine Motel parking lot, grown men fell to their knees and wept. Inside the hospital, Ralph Abernathy stepped out of the emergency room, his suit stained with his best friend's blood, and simply nodded to the reporters. The prophecy of "I've been to the mountaintop" had been fulfilled. The dreamer was gone. And in the terrible silence that followed, a new sound began to rise from the cities of America. Not a song of freedom, but a roar of fire and fury. The Memphis assassination had not just killed a man. It had shattered the hope of a generation. The bullet that struck Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just pierce flesh. It pierced the soul of a nation. For years, King had acted as a dam, holding back the floodwaters of black rage with his gospel of nonviolence. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, that dam broke. The reaction was not grief. It was combustion. Within hours of the Memphis assassination, the United States was at war with itself. It wasn't a coordinated insurrection, but a primal scream of pain. From the tenement blocks of Chicago to the streets of Baltimore, from the neighborhoods of Detroit to the avenues of Kansas City, the ghettos exploded. In Washington, D.C., the sky turned black with smoke. Fires burned within blocks of the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson, looking out from the Oval Office, saw his capital city under siege. He ordered over 13,000 federal troops into the streets, the largest occupation of an American city since the Civil War. Soldiers with bayonets fixed on their rifles stood guard on the steps of the Capitol, the very spot where Martin Luther King Jr. had once dreamed of a table of brotherhood. Now, that table was overturned. Over 110 cities erupted in violence. The damage was catastrophic. Over $45 million in property destroyed, thousands injured, and 43 people dead. It was the Holy Week uprising, a period of mourning that looked more like an apocalypse. To many young African Americans, the death of King was the death of hope. If a man who preached love could be gunned down in cold blood, what was the point of turning the other cheek? The philosophy of nonviolence seemed to die on that balcony along with him. Yet, amidst the sirens and the shattered glass, there were moments of profound grace that reminded the world of what had been lost. In Indianapolis, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of a slain president, was scheduled to speak at a campaign rally in a predominantly black neighborhood. The police chief warned him not to go, saying he couldn't guarantee his safety. Kennedy went anyway. Standing on the back of a flatbed truck in a fraying overcoat, he broke the news to the crowd that Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed. The crowd gasped. Screams of denial rang out. Kennedy, his voice trembling with a pain that was all too personal, discarded his prepared remarks. He spoke not as a politician, but as a man who knew the taste of tragedy. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. He quoted the Greek poet Aeschylus. In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. That night, while other cities burned, Indianapolis remained quiet. It was a testament to the power of empathy, a final flicker of the light King had carried. But tragically, 2 months later, Kennedy himself would fall to an assassin's bullet, extinguishing yet another beacon of hope. Back in Atlanta, the grief was a quieter, heavier thing. Coretta Scott King, now a widow with 4 fatherless children, displayed a stoicism that awed the world. She didn't hide. She didn't scream for vengeance. Instead, just days after the Memphis assassination, she flew to Memphis. She took her husband's place at the head of the sanitation workers' march. She walked through the streets where he was supposed to lead, her face hidden behind a black veil, but her head held high. It was the ultimate act of defiance against the terror of April 4th, 1968. The world watched the funeral on April 9th. It was not a state funeral with caissons and military bands. It was a funeral for a man of the people. Martin Luther King Jr. was carried through the streets of Atlanta not in a limousine, but in a simple farm wagon drawn by 2 mules, symbolizing the poverty he had died fighting to end. Behind that wagon marched 100,000 people. There were sharecroppers in denim overalls walking next to Supreme Court justices in robes. There were movie stars like Harry Belafonte walking next to sanitation workers. The silence of that procession was louder than the riots. It was a river of humanity flowing toward Morehouse College, where the former president of the college, Dr. Benjamin Mays, delivered the eulogy. He would have wanted no other eulogy, Mays said, than this. He died to make men free. The international reaction was equally intense. In London, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out, a rare honor usually reserved for royalty. In the Vatican, Pope Paul VI expressed profound sorrow. From the villages of Africa to the capitals of Europe, Martin Luther King Jr. was mourned not just as an American leader, but as a universal prophet. However, as the fires smoldered and the troops withdrew, a chilling realization settled over America. The dream was not dead, but it was deferred. The civil rights movement had achieved legal victories, but the heart of the nation was still hardened. The bullet that struck King on April 4th, 1968 had revealed a terrifying truth, that in America, the price of truth was death. The prophetic words of "I've been to the mountaintop" rang in everyone's ears. He had promised that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. But looking at the smoking ruins of American cities, the promised land seemed further away than ever. The messenger was gone, and the message was now in the hands of a grieving, angry, and divided people. The storm is long past in Memphis. The Lorraine Motel is now a museum, frozen in time, the cars parked exactly where they were on April 4th, 1968. But the silence that fell after the shot is still deafening. Martin Luther King Jr. did not die an old man, surrounded by family and comfort. He died on a concrete balcony in a city on the edge of chaos, fighting for the dignity of garbage collectors. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of his legacy. He wasn't a marble statue. He was a man of flesh and blood who felt fear, who felt exhaustion, but who kept climbing the mountain anyway. His prophecy of death the night before was not a surrender. It was a declaration of freedom. By accepting that his life might be cut short, he liberated himself from the fear that silences so many of us. He showed us that longevity is not the measure of a life. Impact is. He said, "I may not get there with you." And he was right. He didn't cross into the promised land of total equality. He left that journey to us. He left us the map, drawn with his words and sealed with his blood. Every time we stand up for a stranger, every time we speak truth to power, every time we choose love over hate in the face of injustice, we are taking one more step toward the land he saw from the mountaintop. Some stories end without closure, but dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs a witness. To anyone watching this who has ever felt too small to make a difference or too afraid to speak up, remember the man from Atlanta. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. If this story of Martin Luther King Jr. and his final hours has touched something in you, or if it reminds you of the sacrifices made by those who came before us, please share your thoughts below. We read every comment because your voice is part of the dream he died for. If you believe that the journey to the mountaintop is still worth taking, write, "I have a dream," in the comments. Let's keep the echo of his voice alive. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep climbing.